Thank you everyone for coming today to this policy exchange debate on how can we secure real green growth. My name is James Murray, I'm the editor of BusinessGreen, which if you don't know already is one of the UK's leading sources of online news and analysis for the green economy, which is what we're here to discuss today. I'm very lucky to be joined by a fantastic panel. We have Lord Teverson to my right, who is the co-chair of the Lib Dem Parliamentary Party Committee on Energy and Climate Change, and a long-standing advocate of green growth from the Liberal Democrats. Further to my right, we have David Farmer-Jones from SITA, who have kindly sponsored today's event, one of the UK's leading, we're not allowed to say waste management anymore, are we, but sort of environmental services companies. We'll get onto that later. To my left we have Professor Paul Ekins of UCL, who is also one of the UK's leading economists and analysts of the green economic climate. And finally, from Policy Exchange, we have Simon Moore, who is heavily involved and leads much of their work on energy and climate change. So that's it from me, pretty much, actually. I'm just going to very briefly introduce each of the panellists who will speak for 5 minutes. My phone is on the desk here because I don't have a watch. I'm going to be very rude and check it frequently and tell people to hurry up if they take up too much time. So everybody's going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then that should leave us about 40 minutes for open questions from the floor. The topic is how can we secure real green growth. The key word there is very much real. Obviously a huge number of debates on green growth and the green economy going on this week and beyond. The core issue is that key factor of reality, both in terms of can we deliver real significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, not greenwash and not incremental savings that will do very, very little to help the planet. And also the key point that Policy Exchange has made repeatedly, is this green growth that we're going to deliver going to be additional? Is it actually going to be growth that really helps drive the overall economy, or is it going to come at the expense of other aspects that will be very, very difficult to sell to the voters and could actually do damage in the long term and medium term to the UK economy? So how do we get that balance right whilst dealing with the environmental pressures that we face? To discuss all these issues and more, it's now up to me to hand over to the panel, and our first speaker will be Lord Teverson. So
okay. I was going to say, actually, thanks for inviting me, because Policy Exchange is my favourite think tank. I think someone's already used that, so I can't really do that. But you do, what I really like about Policy Exchange is that you really address issues in a very interesting, challenging way. We don't always like them as Liberal Democrats, but I think they ask the right questions and often on the right side as well. Let's talk about, I like the way also, real green growth. I thought that was just a little, you've emphasised that, and it is right, because there's so much of greenwash around that real green growth is what we want. And to me, this is the one thing, if anything, that should bring the coalition government together, because what it does, it combines green with economic growth. So if you can achieve green growth, you've actually achieved everybody's agenda. Not that growth isn't a Liberal Democrat agenda, it is. Not that green isn't a Conservative agenda, it is. So it ought to be the rock in the middle of a successful coalition programme for getting out of recession and moving into the broad lands of the sunlight of economic growth. But actually what it's turned into is an area of mushy conflict, where no one out there, particularly the business sector, really understands where we're trying to go. Even more in the energy sector, no one really wants to invest, because no one's really sure what the government is committed to or what it should be able to do. And I was, many of you will have read the CBI, John Cridland's comments back in the summer, where he said, absolutely rightly, it is a false choice. Going green and going for growth are not opposite directions, they are part of the same thing. And he emphasised, as we know, that the green economy is estimated to be around some 8% of GDP, £122 billion per annum. And last year, when we were really struggling for any growth in the economy, and this year we're looking at what the OECD, I think, is saying at minus 0.7% recession, then last year, probably green sector of the economy grew by something like 5%. So it's an absolute gift in terms of being able to find a way forward. And yet, what we have within government at the moment is and I know it particularly from energy and climate change, which is the area I look at particularly, there is from the outside, from investors, from business, from industry, the people that generate those jobs and that growth at the end of the day, there is a real question mark about where government stands on these issues, whether it's green energy, well, particularly that area, and green jobs generally. And of course, it's seen very much as a treasury versus DEC, or sometimes BIS, sort of as a different part of the three-part of the triangle problem. And the biggest message has to be that the government has to decide that hopefully this is the right way forward, because it meets both the agendas of both parties in terms of further detoxification, maybe of the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats' green credentials. It is the obvious way forward, and we have to have a much stronger government message going out about this so we can get investment into this sector. And of course, we have the programs there. They are there to fulfill. There's the Green Deal, hopefully going to produce some 60,000, 65,000 jobs or whatever, a huge amount of investment. We have Green Investment Bank, which will finally become a real bank, we hope, if the European Commission allows it in 2015. Slightly later than we would want here, but already putting some investment in directly into the sector. We have electricity market reform, and this is one of the areas where again there is a government trying to push forward, but mixed messages in terms of the technologies behind that, and the whole areas around purchase power agreements, where the contracts for difference will work. But thankfully DEC very much trying to put that agenda to bed during the current parliamentary session. HS2, I would include that as a green growth measure, and yet again the government's been quite courageous in terms of announcing it. Department of Transport, Justin Greening saying yes, go ahead, and then afterwards the government somehow in its mood pulling back from that and thinking, oh, how keen are we or aren't we on that? And again, taking away investor confidence, and in fact confidence in the north and the Midlands of the UK. Smart meter programs going out so we can have a smart grid. And there's whole other areas of I would like to see a lot more into research and development, where again, perhaps the big challenge comes down to the UK. Can we really start to lead and export in this area? And to do that successfully, we have to move far away from the rhetoric, let alone and giving messages of certainty, actually to make sure that again businesses invest and can look outside as well as inside. Chairman, I think I've probably got to my 5 minutes.
Perfect.
The main thing I will say is let's have certainty out of government so we have a real direction and we can get confidence in the sector.
Thank you very much. And straight on to David.
Okay, good afternoon. Now let me take you back to a little bit earlier in this summer, where it's probably the day after the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, and the whole world waxed lyrical, as the media did, on the fantastic opening ceremony, all encased in this wonderful Olympic park. You know, it was an advert of design, construction and architecture. It was world-class infrastructure, delivered on time, on budget, Britain at its best. It was the envy of the world, and we were right to be proud of that. Now let me contrast that to just down the road in Bexley. It's not so far away, about 10 plus miles away. There sits an ultra-modern energy from waste plant, providing energy for 100,000 homes, much needed energy, and renewable at that. 15 years in planning and construction it took for that. 3 public inquiries. How can 2 such infrastructure projects differ in the UK? Now Bexley was a model project funded by not public money, but private money. It's the type of infrastructure that we need in order to use the resources of Britain in a better way. Now our industry has been, as you know, telling the world for some time of the potential for green growth. We estimate of around £20 billion worth of investment is needed to extract the 29 million tonnes of waste that goes to landfill today and use it for something better. That would provide 80,000 jobs, indirect and direct jobs. It would give a significant lift to a construction industry which is on its knees. It would produce 40% of the renewable energy target of the government, 12% of the residential gas, and not only that, millions of tonnes of recycled material which we could put back into the circular economy. So, what's holding us back? Well, I think it's a real vision and the execution of a strategy to deliver this much needed infrastructure. You know, the Olympics had a planning time of 10 years, 7 years in construction, the time before that. The Olympics had, dare I say, Tony Blair, David Cameron, and even Boris Johnson to assist it. There was no waiting, there was no tinkering, there was no endless reviews. Right strategy, delivered. Now, they also had a voice. They had a champion, Sebastian Coe, Lord Coe. You know, our company, our industry has 4 departments within government it has to deal with. BIS, DCLG, DEFRA and DEC. That equals no interest, no plans, no progress, a missed opportunity. Much is talked about legacy in this country. You know, I love sport as much as the next person. And hopefully our children will end up exercising more, thankfully, after the Olympics. But if the government really wanted a true legacy for years to come, then it needs to give us the backing, it needs to give us a champion to help us deliver world-class recycling and waste infrastructure and all the benefits that are associated with that.
Thank you very much, and bang on 5 minutes as well. So over to Professor Paul Ekins, who similarly is 5 minutes from now.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm only going to spend the last bit of my talk actually addressing the question, how do we do this? Because I actually think David put his finger on it. What's holding us back? What's the vision? I'm going to start with why should we be interested in real green growth as opposed to other kinds of growth? What might that kind of growth deliver as opposed to other kinds of growth? And then go on very briefly to the how, because I think actually once we were clear about why it was we were doing it, if that vision was there, we actually know how to deliver it, and there's plenty of examples around the world of other countries that are beginning to do that. I want to go back to the most basic objectives of government. Governments are here to secure territorial integrity, internal security, and food, energy, and water security. Those are the 3 fundamentals. We don't have a society without those. I sometimes wonder why we bother to employ people like chief scientific advisors, because some of you will have noticed that very soon after he took office, the current chief scientific advisor, who's leaving at the end of this year, was talking about a perfect storm in 2030, not 2100, 2030. So 18 years away, when global crises of food, energy and water exacerbated by climate change would severely tax all societies, including ours. To me, that is what green growth is all about. It will secure, if pursued globally, climate stability, resource security, environmental quality, all necessary for human survival and well-being. So that's the vision that we need. That's why real green growth is a desirable objective as opposed to other kinds of growth. The interesting thing is that although that's the real reason for it, green growth also offers enormous industrial opportunity. And of course, in the current economic climate, that is what most commentators are focusing on. The reason for this is that the UK is not alone in having a chief scientific advisor who's noticed that these challenges are coming up on the horizon. Practically all countries are wanting to move towards lower carbon, resource security, and environmental quality. And that means that the low carbon environmental goods and services sector is among the fastest growing sectors worldwide. And there's plenty of data from OECD and others to show that. And that means that if the UK can develop comparative advantage in those areas, the export opportunities are enormous. I've always been a great admirer of Richard Branson because he kind of manages to see, having got a good brand, Virgin, he manages to see which sectors of the economy are about to grow and then moves in a professional and entrepreneurial way into those sectors. Well, low carbon environmental goods and services isn't really a sector like aviation, or trains, or health. It's a set of activities across the economy that I think actually is much more than the 8% that Robin Teverson talked about. The UK has currently got the 6th largest industry across these various activities, real areas of comparative advantage which we can build on and develop. So to the how, my last minute or two. Markets, the most important, from economists' point of view, the most important insight about this sector, because it's different to the other kinds of sectors, is that markets won't get into these sectors by themselves. But markets are essential for delivery in these sectors at scale. So I can't better what Robin Teverson said about the need for public and consistent, credible policy that will encourage large-scale investment into these sectors. It's curious that I go to many presentations with civil servants, and normally the first slide the civil servants put up is the need for credible and consistent public policy in these areas. That's the first slide. And then everything else that follows proceeds to undermine that basic message. And we've seen no shortage of that from utterances at the highest level of government over the last few months. That's the essential. Without that, we don't stand a chance, and at the moment we haven't got that. So that there's hundreds of millions of pounds of foreign direct investment waiting to come to this country from big name companies, and they have explicitly said that until we get the policy framework sorted out, it's no deal, because they have to be assured that they can make money for at least 30 years from enormously capital intensive upfront investments which need to pay back over that period of time. In addition to that, we need targeted and efficient regulation. Vehicle fuel efficiency, building regulations come to mind. We need research and development and innovation support. And we need not necessarily a huge amount, but well-targeted public investment through something like the Green Investment Bank, and it's nice to have that vehicle now, with high leverage. In Germany, the KfW Bank gets leverage of 1 to 15. So for every billion euros that the government gives KfW, the private sector puts in 50 billion euros into these sorts of sectors. But without policy consistency, all is in vain, because the private investors won't believe they will get their money back, the policy risk will be too high. Huge challenges actually in the implementation of these policies, because they're not all win-win. There will be losers as well as winners. There are ideological, political and economic barriers to be overcome, the first two of which have been very much in evidence over the last few months. That's my 5 minutes. I hope we can have some nice discussion on these issues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. And finally, Simon Moore from the Policy Exchange.
Thank you, James. As is usually the case, being last to go, I think my predecessors have pretty much picked the subjects clean, but I will try not to be too repetitive. For those of you not familiar with Policy Exchange's philosophy on environmental issues, Policy Exchange argues that environmental challenges, particularly climate change, need to be tackled, but at lowest cost. The lower their cost, the more likely it is that policies will be politically sustainable, and therefore the more likely they are to meet their longer-term environmental objectives. I think James rightly identified a bit of a clue in the title of today's event for how we have come to think about green growth, that a lot of what is discussed as being green growth is perhaps not quite as real as it should be. That there are things that can be done better in order to secure green growth, but they are not always the things that ministers are referring to when they use that phrase. First of all, I think it's worth pointing out that green growth or the green economy gets talked about as if it's a specific sector of the economy. I think rather we should be thinking about how we make environmental concerns or green issues part of the entire economy, not just treating it like it's something separate to be dealt with on its own. A lot of talk about green growth lately has come to mean one specific thing, which is the government taxing everybody and subsidizing particular industries which are chosen as potential growth or export industries of the future, most prominently renewable energy as a means of delivering that hoped for growth in the future. There have been plenty of these kinds of industrial policy interventions historically, and there is very little, they've rarely turned out well. That is where the growth half can potentially get compromised under the green growth objective. But it can also threaten the green half if that spending is particularly wasteful. We risk squandering public goodwill if more of the public come to believe that money could be being spent more wisely. That can threaten the long-term political sustainability of policies that are characterized as green growth. If money is not spent well, you can also risk turning off other countries from following our lead. This is a particular concern when it comes to climate change, a global problem that requires the participation of the entire world, not just of the UK or of Europe. And finally, we risk not achieving as much for the environment as we otherwise could. The less you spend for each unit of carbon reduction, the more you can get for a given budget. A relentless focus on cost effectiveness doesn't indicate a lack of commitment to tackling climate change. On the other hand, it is the only way that it can be tackled. So, while the green growth concept may have, in practice, morphed into something undesirable, it's still important that policies are in place that mean growth becomes greener. Climate policies, particularly a strong, effective and long-term carbon price, are a key part of that, but it's not the only consideration. Across the economy, more efficient use of resources lowers costs and improves productivity. This applies to energy, sure, but it also applies to other things. We've heard about smarter reuse of waste. It can also refer to more efficient, less polluting vehicles, sensible regulation of air pollution, which harms people's health to the level of 29,000 deaths a year and some £15 billion lost to the economy. When talking about waste, the landfill tax has been a good, quiet success in introducing a small pricing nudge that has led to a lot of successful innovation. Other similar small incentives like carrier bag charges or bottle deposits are other ways where environmental objectives can be steered towards. Finally, it means finding better ways of protecting and potentially enhancing the natural environment. This means realizing that conservation is not simply the avoidance of development on green land. It can also mean improving biodiversity, but this requires investment, and that means you have to value the natural environment. In all of these instances, it provides both the resources to tackle an environmental problem and underpins the public desire to see them tackled. Environmental awareness has always gone hand in hand with societal wealth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's all four of our presentations. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. So we'll move straight on to the questions from the audience. If I could ask everybody to please phrase their questions as questions and not eat up 5 minutes themselves with speeches, that would be great. If you try to do that, I will have to be rude and interrupt you, and I really don't want to be. So please phrase your questions as questions. And the gentleman here has his hand up first.
I've got a question about the fact, I'd like your comments about the subsidy, by the way, that has to be taken into account. But the other issue, Britain has a very open economy. It relies on trade with the rest of the world, and we've always benefited hugely from that. And in fact, people in Britain are proud about our open economy. But many countries in the world seem to be far less concerned than we are about helping to do things about climate change. I'm thinking in particular of the United States, but also India and China, and many countries in South America, the so-called BRICS, Russia. So these are our competitors. We're not just competing with countries in the European Union, and in fact, we know the serious problems of the European Union at the moment. So the more we sort of spend on, especially subsidies, and trying to develop industries that may or may not have a future and purpose, are we hobbling ourselves when it comes to competing against other countries in the world that where this seems to be much lower down on the agenda? Especially in the United States, they seem to be moving to a view that we have to adapt to climate change and not stop it.
Interesting point. Lord Teverson.
Well, in terms of, we are a relatively open economy, and it's a big issue. And of course, what we do actually is we subcontract all our carbon footprint. We celebrate the fact that we've met our Kyoto targets, we've done all that. And of course, what we've done is export all our carbon to BRIC countries to produce those goods for us, and then we re-import them. So that's how we've actually got round it, and that's actually allowed us. That's been allowed through an open economy. But it's a big issue. And of course, the biggest noise has been made by the high energy intensive industries, which Treasury has taken some notice of in terms of us becoming uncompetitive in certain areas in Europe, particularly when we move maybe to auctioning of European emission scheme units. And I think there is an issue there. We can get all the reports that we like about that and saying it isn't a great problem, but I think it's one of the issues that we do solve. And of course, if we can talk about carbon barriers on our around Europe or whatever, but of course WTO doesn't like that, and quite rightly, I can imagine some EU member states would use it as a protection method. So there are all sorts of areas to be sorted out in that way. But will we become uncompetitive? No, I don't think we will necessarily, and I think there's a whole slew of issues around competition, and we have to stay ahead on a broad front on those, and I think really climate change is just one.
David, SITA is an international company. Are you concerned about the impact on competitors?
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting to take Lord Teverson's point about exporting. We export 4 million tonnes of resources to China in the very shipping containers which they import our goods, and we have, I agree with Lord Teverson, exported our industrial base to the Far East. What I think we need really is a clear industrial policy, and that's what this paper starts to talk about this. I think it's regrettable that it's halfway through a mandate period. I think you need to be looking to come in immediately in government, because these things take a long time. So I would suggest you need a strong industrial policy linked to infrastructure development, and I think our sector would be a great example of that. If we could take back those 4 million tonnes and start to create longer term a resource and reprocessing industry in the UK, that would be a great way of stimulating growth and jobs.
Although, Simon, you suggested sort of interventionist industrial policy doesn't have a great record of working. Is that?
Well, I think.
I presume you'd agree with the concern about competitiveness.
I mean, I think that this question highlights one of the big flaws in UK climate policy, which is that it's very much UK oriented. It's not particularly globally oriented. The Committee on Climate Change's mission, for instance, looks at how to decarbonise the UK economy. It doesn't necessarily look at how to tackle climate change. This results in a sort of focus on UK-specific or UK-oriented technologies. I think offshore wind is the one of which we've been most critical. They talk about it being uniquely well-suited to the UK, which is probably true, but the flip side of that is it's uniquely less suited to the rest of the world than other technologies are. I think what we've argued previously is that the sort of the technology development aspects of UK climate policy should be much more focused towards technologies with global spillover and less focused on the 1 to 2% that the UK emits.
Cool. And Professor Ekins, anything to add?
Yeah, lots, but not enough time to add it in.
It's a big issue, isn't it?
Are we hobbling ourselves? That all depends on the level of costs. Are the costs very high? You will have noticed what, in my view, has been an almost entirely fraudulent campaign to persuade voters that the costs are very high. At the moment, the costs on people's energy bills are not very high for the great majority of households, for the great majority of industrial sectors. There are a few industrial sectors which are badly affected, and if we were to go on being among relatively few countries that take climate change seriously, then it is quite clear to me that we would need to do more for those sectors than we are currently doing. And the Germans are a case in point. They do an enormous amount. They have high environmental taxes on most of their businesses and on their households, much higher than we do on the households, and then very large exemptions. Either that or we move to border tax adjustments, about which I won't say any more, but you probably know what I'm talking about. I disagree fundamentally with Simon on my left about a whole raft of things he said, not least about offshore wind, the global opportunities for which are in fact very great. Exactly the same arguments could have been made about offshore oil and gas, which the UK economy was one of the first to get into in the first energy price rises back in the 70s, and in fact we've done very well by developing those technologies with very considerable amounts of public subsidy, one may say, but of course people are always rather less concerned about subsidies when they go to the oil and gas industry, because there are far fewer vested interests to complain about that. But the last thing I would just like to say is about your comment, which may be accurate, about is it preferable to adapt to climate change? Because I regard that as probably just about the most dangerous suggestion that it's possible to make. The climate science has not only been pretty clear for some time, notwithstanding the fact that the fossil fuel and other industries spend very large sums of money in order to try to muddy that water, but actually the climate scientists since 1990, when I started looking at this issue, have been very conservative about what they have been saying, and on practically every front they have been wrong-footed by the actual events on the ground.
I'm not promoting.
I know you're not.
This is what many people in the United States seem to be now saying.
I
huge country.
I absolutely agree with that, and it's extremely regrettable, and that is the biggest single block to proper global climate policy, which obviously we need. The Chinese and the Indians are quite different case, because they're investing very heavily in new technologies, low carbon technologies, much more than one would have expected at their level of industrial development. But I quite agree the United States is a problem. And unfortunately, there are people with very large sums of money who are prepared to tell lies pretty well non-stop on privately owned media networks that have a lot of influence. And that is a really big difficulty in a country like the US.
Well, the interesting thing with the US is always that debate is very much happening at the federal level. At the state level, there is a lot of progressive legislation coming into play. California, one of the world's largest economies, will have carbon pricing relatively soon. And a lot of the US companies are leading investors in green technologies, particularly out of Silicon Valley. So there is hope there, even though I agree entirely the federal climate is not good. Gentleman here at the front with the next question.
Okay. Neil Stockley from Greenwich Local Party. Last year, the OECD Environment Directorate produced a comprehensive report on green growth policies, and that included frameworks for countries like the UK. And some of the areas they suggested, like the Green Investment Bank, in fact they picked on the Green Investment Bank as a model policy. Some of the policies we're already doing. Others they suggested are less perfect in this country, and I'm referring there to especially carbon taxes. And our carbon tax regime is a bit of a mess at the moment, very inconsistent. They also said stop subsidising fossil fuels through the tax system and through tax incentives, and the coalition government has continued to give the oil and gas industry very generous subsidies. So I'd like to get the panel's reaction to that. How do we get a robust and coherent system of carbon taxation? And what do we do about fossil fuel subsidies?
Very interesting question. I've noticed that David did hint yesterday about talks or starting to look again at the question of environmental taxation. Lord Teverson, what is the Lib Dem position currently on environmental and indeed carbon
You're going to choose
taxation?
me every time.
Well, no, just for this one.
Well, in terms of Liberal Democrat policy, then their policy is very definitely that taxation should move towards polluters and away from good things like employment. Doing that has been more difficult under the coalition government, and there's lots of room still to do that. But yes, certainly in environmental taxation, carbon taxation. I mean, one of the things which concerns me, well, in terms of sort of carbon taxation, I mean, is whether the aviation on the European emissions trading scheme is about to fall to pieces with all the pressures that are going on internationally there. I mean, I know that's a European issue, but that's one of the ones where we could see quite a major move back. But we do need to be consistent about that. But I'd rather take maybe Paul's point of view. I don't think all subsidy would be wrong on any sector. It depends on what we're trying to develop and what we're trying to do. And of course, one of the biggest subsidies on the coal and gas sector would be carbon capture and storage, where we're trying to offer £1 billion actually to sort that out. And while I might be quite sceptical about whether we'll actually get to a commercial out at the end of the day, something like trying to do that through a competitive regime and a tender regime, which has been very, very, very difficult indeed to try to get sort of the market least cost side into it, and showing how difficult that policy is. Maybe CCS is something that if we could make it happen is really important, and so I think we will still have some subsidies in that area.
Simon, a proper carbon tax is the simplest market-based mechanism for solving all these problems, isn't it?
We have a vast range of different carbon prices that affect different parts of the UK economy at the moment, from very high on some of the heavy industry side to almost none at all on things like stuff that's used for domestic heating. I think the OECD document you referred to about subsidies for oil and gas sector, some 80% of that comes from VAT on domestic gas and energy being much lower than it is for any other product. Do politicians want to go near that and say, well, I'm going to make your energy bills 15% higher, but we may offset it somewhere else in the tax code? It'd be brave, but it'd be interesting to see more work on it.
It is that challenge, isn't it? It's balancing the status quo with what needs to be changed. And Paul,
Yeah, I mean, the politics of this is very difficult. The most obvious thing to do is to extend the carbon price floor to the European level. There's an opportunity to do that through the Energy Tax Directive, but I don't need to tell you that the politics of doing that is likely to be difficult with your coalition partners who refused, almost uniquely in Europe, to allow the introduction of a European carbon energy tax back in the early 1990s. Had we gone down that route, we would have been spared the nightmare of the European emission trading scheme, as it has turned out to be. So it just shows that second-best policies can be very poor indeed. What should the UK be doing now that we've got the carbon price floor, the climate change levy, and the CRC, although the CRC is still a bit in limbo? Well, certainly the climate change levy and the CRC should be merged into a single instrument. I think there is the purpose of the purpose of the carbon price floor, of course, is mainly to stimulate low carbon investment in the power sector, which is a rather different intention to the other two. And then just on Simon's point, calling for more work, it's something the OECD and all these other bodies loves to do, is say that subsidies on fossil fuels are a very bad thing and all countries should remove them. The single biggest subsidy on fossil fuel in this country is undoubtedly the 5% VAT rate on household use of energy, and it ought to go up to 20%, which is an environmentally perverse subsidy of the first order to the tune of several £billion a year. Now again, this would be a politically brave, I'm an academic, I'm allowed to call for that kind of thing, because no one pays any attention to what I say. But it's, we've just finished some work with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation that shows that you could use that revenue easily to remove the regressive effects of this environmentally perverse subsidy. and start having a much more even carbon price across the economy, because of course it's households that have the lowest carbon price of all. But that doesn't mean that governments are likely to jump at the opportunity to introduce this measure.
Absolutely. David, SITA deals with an environmental tax that is often held up as successful in the landfill tax arena. I mean, would you like to see more of this approach, more sort of effective?
Well, we believe, and our
pricing?
industry believes in the polluter pays policy. To your point, that the landfill tax is a great behavioural agent of change, and it has been since its introduction in sort of the early 2000s. So I think that I would call for a continuation of that to change behaviour. Certainly in Scandinavia, where I've worked for some considerable time, they use much more progressive green taxation to make behavioural change. I would also say that in terms of carbon, it would be interesting, as the colleague talked about, high consumption industries. And we don't think logically in this country by placing industry with energy production. So why not having an energy from waste plant next to chemical plants, etc.? Because that really does use energy in a far more sophisticated manner. We don't have that joined up thinking. So I call for more of that.
Absolutely, it's a key point. Gentleman in the middle here.
Hello, Peter Smith from National Energy Action. I can take exception to some of what Paul said. We're a fuel poverty charity, and I wouldn't be the first one to question his views on affordability now and into the future. I'll just say that energy prices have doubled since 2004. The debate around affordability, whether or not affordability is really the victim of green policies and green growth, expresses a tension which is being sort of played out at the moment. The fact that increasingly our energy goals are going to be financed by energy consumers will mean that they'll continue to be in tension. If I was an MP, I'd clearly be asking what can I do to make sure that the spoils that are there nationally are shared out at a local level. So how can we ensure that things like the revenue that the Treasury will receive as a result of the carbon tax, for instance, could be invested at a local level to enhance sustainability, reduce that sort of regressive impact that we're clearly looking at the moment.
So is there a case for more ring fencing of these carbon taxes and environmental levies, I suppose, is the core of the question. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, the key thing that all research on environmentally perverse subsidies has shown is that although very often the rationale for them is to benefit relatively low-income people, most of the subsidy actually goes to relatively high-income people, and therefore, as a means of helping low-income people, it is extremely inefficient. And exactly that same is true for the VAT on household energy. Now, when the last Conservative government, back in the 90s, wanted to introduce VAT in the first place, it signally failed to make any kinds of arrangements for low-income households, which was one of the reasons why that policy was so toxic and was so controversial, and eventually could not be implemented and brought down then to 5% by Gordon Brown. That doesn't mean that at some point a brave politician couldn't try again, using those revenues both for the energy efficiency for low-income homes, but also for compensation through the benefit system. One of the things we found with the modelling we've done with IFS in this work that will be published in December is that actually the universal credit makes it much, much easier to compensate low-income households than the current very complicated raft of benefits. So that it would be very possible to do that. And I mean, the holy grail of such a reform, of course, would be you would get the price signal coming through to all consumers, but you would have that revenue then to be targeted at the low-income consumers, whereas most of it currently just benefits high-income consumers. That would make an enormous difference to the Green Deal, because of course it would mean the golden rule could be much more easily satisfied, because energy prices would be higher, far more households would be likely to take it up, and then we could start to get going on this home energy improvement, which has been so difficult to kickstart, and in my view, under the current arrangements, unless they change very radically, is not going to be terribly effective.
Anybody else like to add anything on this issue?
So just quickly, I mean, I think it seems to me at least that a lot of the government's effort to offset the kind of fuel poverty impacts of climate and energy policy is being done through the energy efficiency program, Green Deal, Eco, etc. Most of the other stuff, ETS, renewables obligation, potentially EMR in the future, upward pressure on bills. The efficiency stuff is meant to counterbalance that, but I think we're a ways away from seeing how well that's going to work in practice. I think it puts an awful lot of pressure on the Green Deal, particularly, also Eco to a lesser extent, to actually deliver these things that the government has promised consumers, because if they're telling people bills are going to come down, or at least bills aren't going to go up very much, and it turns out that's entirely contingent on being a Green Deal taker, you're going to have a lot of problem from the people who don't end up in it.
Particularly if the government doesn't push the Green Deal hard with messaging to make people sign up.
I think one of the things that's important, slightly broadly, it's the community benefit side of all of this. And I think it was interesting to see Ed Davey yesterday in his speech particularly concentrate on the fact that we have to solve this thing around, maybe not so much directly related to fuel poverty, but where you have renewable energy schemes, particularly like onshore wind, then you have to give real community benefit around those developments, because you have to go with the flow, if you like, and you have to convince communities these things are worth having, and they get some of the benefit of them. So I think there is that broader area. As far as hypothecation of taxes is concerned, then Treasury will never like it, but there is it. I mean, the landfill tax is an example where it does happen in some of the financial services area. The money that's used for fines does come back into the sector. So it isn't an impossible argument, and I think it's that's one of the areas that we do need to consider.
We'll take a question from this side of the room, the lady in the second row.
Yes, I think can we turn to housing, because this is seen as one of the levers of building our environment again, the announcement about extensions and so on, and yet this cuts rather across some of the work that, say, Matthew Taylor, Lord Taylor has been doing about housing development, planning for housing, planning for communities, which is where you can start building in the green benefits, because there's then the economies of scale. And I just wondered how the panel would see us managing to integrate this as a far more active policy than just building extensions onto houses, to really get the green benefits out of it and to get growth.
Absolutely. Sergeant, it's that core point you made that it's not the green economy, it is the whole economy, isn't it? It's baking this stuff in from the start.
That's right. I mean, I'm not a housing policy expert, but I think it's very clear to everybody that there is a housing problem in this country, and that more housing is going to happen one way or another. I think a lot of that debate, particularly the environmental angle on that debate, has been looking at protecting the green belt or not, issues around that, not so much looking at building code rules for what, energy efficiency standards for buildings, etc. So I think there's definitely a case to be made on that.
I mean, David, it's crucial for recycling and sort of waste management.
Well, I would just make a comment that I think the government is kidding itself if it thinks it's going to solve the growth issues and supporting the construction industry by building in Middle England extensions. I really do. Come back to the issue about putting a clear plan together in order to develop infrastructure that we need. That's where the money is, that's where the real jobs are. I'd come back to the point earlier that Lord Teverson made, which is related to it. We've done a lot of work in terms of incentivisation around our particular facilities, which are difficult to get planning on at a local level. We were the early movers in that sense. I think you're right that we have to get the communities accepting perhaps the disamenity effect that they have, but sharing in that, and we've been an advocate of that for some time. So I think you've got to link those sorts of green investment that we talk about to people in the local area receiving, reduced prices. We think that's a good way to try and get that relationship going.
On a similar line, I was speaking to one of the Lib Dem's coalition partners recently, and they raised the prospect that if there is going to be relaxation of planning rules around the green belt, and we are going to see more housing on the green belt, the quid pro quo that environmental groups should demand is that any property building that happens there is to the very, very highest environmental standard, and they actually do become model green communities. Next question, we've only got 10 more minutes, so gentleman right at the back row.
Nice to have the Green Alliance. A lot of the discussion has been about how we ensure that green growth knows its place. It doesn't threaten old industries. It doesn't harm the consumer in any way. Just to turn it round a little bit, what can we do to ensure that the old industries don't get in the way of green growth? That was a third of our nation's growth last year.
It's the crucial question in many ways, is it not? Paul, maybe you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of incentives, in the sense that there is no shortage of money waiting to be invested in sectors that look as if they can be profitable. In the green economy, that largely means sectors that have been de-risked from a policy point of view. Some of the sectors will be profitable, but for some reason the investment isn't taking place. You probably know the Dean Hollins study that suggests that there's 23 billion pounds in resource efficiency savings that have a payback of less than a year, and then another 33 billion with a payback of between 1 and 5 years. So that's all investment which, if the incentives are right, will come forward, and undoubtedly some industries will find that challenging and others will not. Others will grow, but kind of that's what capitalism does. Capitalism continually renews itself in line with the incentives that face the economy. At the moment, we don't have a coherent set of incentives to move the economy consistently in the direction of circular economy, resource efficiency, low carbon. That is what has to be put in place, and capitalist market forces will then do their bit.
Lord Teverson, just to paraphrase the question slightly, how do we stop the oil and gas lobbyists stopping the green progress that you want to see? And also, as we're at a political conference, how do we stop some of your coalition colleagues who have increasingly signed up to that agenda, blocking the progress that you want to see?
Well, I think I think we have to be sure about the basis that we're working on. One of the things that concerns me most is that we, at the end of the day, we all as parties in Parliament signed up to the Climate Change Act, and that requires a whole series of carbon budgets, the Climate Change Committee and all that area, and what we have to do is to assure ourselves that we will not go over a line that takes us away from those particular targets. Can I just come back though? Back to old industry, if you like, a new industry. And it comes a bit to Sue Doughty's point. I just want to get on to the thorny problem of regulation, because this, in the environmental area, regulation is a bad term generally in politics these days, it's said, but regulation is really important. And one of the things that old industry mustn't do is get in the way of environmental standards on new products in the future, whether it's housing in particular. And why have we got fuel poverty that we talked about before? It's because we built lousy houses all through the 50s, 60s and 70s, which should have never been built at the standards that they were. And yet what we do is we get, well, in terms of emission standards on cars set at European level, but we had the whole German industry move against that. We managed to get a reasonable outcomes on that. Did we see the European car industry on its knees? Well, I seem to suspect, I understand the German car industry is actually doing quite well at the moment, particularly in markets like China. So, and we're leading the world in those environmental standards. So what I would say is that what we must make sure old industry doesn't do, and what they do is come along with us on setting advanced standards and regulation on environmental emissions, and that we actually make sure that those are world standards. I'm sorry, that's not quite the answer.
No, that's quite all right. No, we have time for just a couple more quick questions. Gentleman here's had his hand up for a while.
Simon, in your presentation, you referred to things like the plastic bag tax and bottle fund schemes. Can such marginal measures ever drive the level of investment that we need, given the threats of climate change and energy security, which we're also hearing about in 2030? And a question for David on that is, within your own investment experience, is the landfill tax more of a driver, or is it the waste directives and things like that which really influence what sort of investments you make?
We'll go to Simon first. Is a plastic bag tax a waste of time?
I don't think anybody anticipates the plastic bag tax solving climate change, but I think the point with things like this is to have those small incentives leaning on people's behaviour that can alter the way they think about a particular thing. We don't have it on, as we talked about earlier, on domestic energy, for instance, any kind of carbon pricing or any strong carbon price signal. Things like that where no signals at all are present are places where we can improve the policy framework.
There's also a point that if the Daily Mail is actually in favour of progressive green tax, then we really should just go with it. Because it doesn't happen very often. Michael, you wanted to add something quick?
Well, I did want to add something on the landfill tax. I was fascinated in this initial presentation that Simon referred to the landfill tax as a kind of small pricing nudge. I would remind people that it was introduced in 1996 at £7 a tonne. Next year it will be £80 a tonne. 72 and then 80 the year after, I think. Okay, so it's going up to 80. That is a colossal pricing nudge, not a small pricing nudge. And I remember when Peter Jones was saying, when it was the £3 escalator, he was saying, well, actually, at £36 a tonne, that will drive the industry investment that we need. I remember him saying it very clearly. When we got to £36 a tonne, it suddenly was £80 a tonne, and the government bought that and has got it up there, and we are now beginning to see that investment coming through the system, but it has taken an enormous pricing signal in order to achieve that. And we need a similar signal backed up with other measures for the three big opportunities in the low carbon area. And I'm addressing Lord Teverson's statement that we are legally committed to these low carbon targets. We need low carbon generation now because it's such long-term investment. We can't afford another round of gas-fired generation for base load. We need new vehicles for transport that do not run on internal combustion engines, and we need all the infrastructure and the fuels that go with that, and we need complete building decarbonisation of the 85% of the buildings that will still be in existence by 2050. So that's an enormous agenda.
Yeah. And David, has it, in your experience, has it worked?
Plastic means, I do drop my head in there. When I hear that, it's political tokenism. If you look at it's a minuscule amount of oil which is used in order to produce that. If we're really serious about developing an impact, then you should reduce the speed of cars on motorways, you should make more fuel efficient cars. That has a massive effect. This is just a bit of a media push. In terms of landfill tax, yeah, it has been very effective. It has required, as Paul was saying, quite an increase in order to get to a level where different forms of technology can be introduced to improve the situation. First and foremost, obviously, that's recycling, because that's the quickest and cheapest form of diversion. And now as we enter £72, we now head towards where other forms of technologies, energy from waste, which can be introduced. And so it has been particularly effective, I think.
And the gentleman here has been politely waiting, so he gets the privilege of the last question.
Thank you. Jeremy Nicholson from the Energy Intensive Users Group, and I must declare an interest. I work for some of the industries that are most at risk of carbon leakage, but the panel may be relieved to know my question isn't about that on this occasion. In his speech, Ed Davies said, with respect to green energy supplies, we must not get trapped into technology targets, we must not pick winners. In my view, a commendable statement of classical liberalism, but I wonder whether the panel agree. And with that in mind, and Professor Ekins' comments about where we might wish to be by 2030, do you think we've taken too inflexible approach so far, with perhaps an overemphasis on the admittedly important matter of decarbonising electricity supplies, with inadequate attention to decarbonising heat and transport?
Yeah, very interesting. All the scenarios that we've produced over the last 10 years or so, and we've done impact assessments for most of the government white papers with the energy system model that we've developed through the UK Energy Research Centre, have suggested that easily the most cost-effective way of decarbonising heat and transport is through electricity, because it is cheaper to decarbonise electricity through some combination as yet to be determined of not zillions of possibilities, either big renewables or new nuclear or CCS. Lots of uncertainties about the costs and even with CCS whether it will work, and that's why we have to continue to go hell for leather down all those routes to see whether EDF can build at less than 160 pounds a megawatt, or whatever these uncertainties are, whether offshore wind can come down to £100 per megawatt as per the accelerator program. So if that's picking winners, then we have simply got to develop those technologies in order to provide ourselves with the ability to decarbonise heat and transport further down the line through electric vehicles or hydrogen, in replacing internal combustion engines on the one hand, and through rolling out heat pumps and then large-scale biomass district heating for the heating. And the biomass district heating obviously isn't the electrification part of that, but it's a much more efficient use of electricity as well through CHP. And those are really the only options that we have for reaching the kinds of targets that we have adopted through the Climate Change Act post 2030. And the big danger is that we won't do what is required now in order to put the infrastructure in place in order to meet those targets post 2030, and then we will either have to repeal the Climate Change Act because we can't meet the targets, or we will have to strand a lot of assets, very, very expensive investments that we made now in all sorts of high carbon stuff that is not fit for purpose post 2030, which still has useful life to go.
Perfect. I think we have to wrap up there, unfortunately. We've overrun slightly by a few minutes, and obviously there's a full programme this afternoon for everybody. So I think we'll leave it there, unless anybody has any burning final comments from the panel. No, it looks like that. Well, thank you very much for all your questions.